I am Philip Jenkins. My co-director, Thomas Kidd, is currently off supervising Baylor students in Scotland, so we'll have a moment of silence for his efforts at the moment. As I said, the theme of this conference just seemed so critical, so necessary. When we first conceived it a couple of years ago, it seemed very timely, but these days you can't pick up a newspaper without seeing headlines about persecution, massacre, the slaughter of religious minorities. What could be more timely? So we have a conference, and when we organized the conference, we thought, who shall we have to speak? And our immediate comment was, well, Peter Balakian, and who else? Peter was so much at the top of our list. I first discovered his work back in 2004 when I read his history of the genocide, The Burning Tigris, and I didn't know who he was. I said, oh, this man is a first-class Middle East historian. And then he published a memoir by I believe it's his great-uncle, Grigoris Balakian, one of the survivors of the genocide, and I said, oh, fine historian. Then I looked into his work, and I saw this was his second string, and that was alarming. Peter is primarily a poet, a memoirist, a creative writer, but also, as I say, a historian of the absolute first rank. I could pay the man many tributes, but I'll just give one quote that I think should be valued more than any other. He is the American conscience of the Armenian Genocide. Higher praise than which I cannot give. His doctorate is from Brown University. Since 1980, he has taught at Colgate University, where he is the Donald and Constance Rebar Professor of Humanities, Director of the Creative Writing Program. As I say, he has won many awards and honors. I won't begin to list them here. We would be here till all hours. But I particularly want to single out one, the 2012 Alison Clifford Spendlove Prize in Social Justice, Diplomacy, and Tolerance. This is a figure of the absolute world class and a very, very distinguished writer. I also want to say one thing on a personal note. I found myself in a Baylor time warp in the sense that at a relatively late stage, I found that I had to take over somebody's class beginning at 6:30. So I will be hearing off fairly shortly, and my colleague from English, Richard Russell, will be taking over the Master of Ceremonies position at that stage. But at this point, may I invite you to, may I ask you to welcome a very distinguished scholar and speaker, Peter Balakian.
Professor Jenkins, thank you so much and for your hosting and greeting today. And Professors Kidd and Russell, thank you for your part in the hosting of this today. And to the Institute for the Study of Religions, which I know is the forum in which I'm speaking. I'm grateful that some of you have read my memoir, Black Dog of Fate, for courses you're in right now. And it is special to be here in a symposium that is situating the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide as it is. It's an important moment, and as I'm saying it, I'm just reminding myself I got to turn my cell phone off. So if you haven't turned yours off, I'll at least ask you to, and if you don't, well, that's your call. All right. It's a complicated, interesting, important moment, the 100th. And we can talk more about that in our Q&A moment, okay? Because while I'm not going to give a lecture that deals with the Turkish government's 100 years of denialism on the Armenian Genocide. It is certainly an important part of the complexity of this history and its aftermath. So to think about commemoration and 100 years having passed, one is also called to reflect on the complexity of crimes against humanity that are done with impunity and issues surrounding ethics and social justice. So, happy to entertain that in the Q&A. I also just want to say how wonderful it is to be here and to see the ground and green and flowers. I mean, it's been a long northeastern winter, and Colgate University is in the middle of New York State. So again, I haven't seen the ground for a while. This is really, for me, this is liberating. As I drove up today from Houston on, I think it was Texas Road number 6, am I right? It was a kind of wonderful sense of driving through America, and a part of America I don't know, so I'm really happy to be here. Now, here's what let me just frame what I want to do tonight in around 40 minutes or so, and then I really look forward to the conversation with you all about any or all spokes that come off of my talk in this history. I'd like to situate the Armenian Genocide in a context of the modern, of modernity, of the second decade of the 20th century. I'm not going to theorize modernity a la Adorno, Horkheimer, Hannah Arendt, Foucault, Zygmunt Bauman. That's not my perspective tonight, but it's a more political and social and cultural situation of the modality of the mass killing of the Armenians by the Ottoman government in 1915 as a paradigm shift from older forms of genocidal practice. So I'm arguing today, and I've argued this in various articles that I've written, that the genocide carried out by the Ottoman Turkish government in 1915 engages new modalities of mass killing, and those modalities of mass killing can be understood by understanding certain salient features of what we would come to call the modern. All right, so to say that first, I want to note this. And my training is mostly is as an Americanist. My PhD training is in American culture, American literature, and American history. When from an American and even Western European perspective, we talk about the 19-teens, we are often engaged in narratives and discourses surrounding innovation, dynamism, and the excitement of the new. I mean, if you just think about, in fact, there's a very interesting book by Rudnick and Heller called 1915, The Modern Moment. Now that's really interesting if you're thinking about the Armenian Genocide. 1915, The Modern Moment. Now, the Rudnick-Heller book is interested in kind of overviewing the dynamism of cultural innovation defined by the new woman. The suffrage movement is about to culminate in its first major breakthrough with the vote in the election of 1918. The new psychology. Freud is really, in the moment of being embraced as a kind of normative modernist paradigm, psychoanalysis and the kind of psychology that Freud had been practicing for the previous decades. The new art, the new literature, the new poetry. I mean, if I just say to you, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, Faulkner, or in the arts, Picasso, Braque, Juan Gris. I mean, you get what I'm saying. I don't have time to dig open all those texts tonight. Stravinsky, Isadora Duncan, the new dance, the new journalism. So the sense of, and Stravinsky and Daliev and the Rite of Spring, all culminating in this this dynamic 1915 moment that we identify with progress, change, evolution. And let us not forget the infrastructure of technology. I mean, think about the middle of the second decade of the 20th century. For the first time, we have cinema as a popular genre, as a popular media. We have the radio as a popular media. We have record production, the Victrola, the music industry is taking off just in the middle of the second decade of the 20th century. Electricity is lighting urban areas. The car is just on the verge of becoming a middle-class object, on the verge of becoming. It will more fully become so in the 1920s. So if we think about all that, the telephone, the Victrola, electricity, pop music, and you add it with all the other news, you're getting a very interesting moment in the evolution of some of the features that theorists and philosophers will come to identify with, and literary and art critics will come to identify as modernity, right? At the same time, and the reason I want to open with this perspective is to suggest some things about irony and paradox that always define the complexity of history. At the same time, we know that 1914 commences what will be known as World War I, what was called the Great War. A war in which, for the first time, mass technological killing could take the lives of 60 to 70,000 young men, boys really, right, in the trenches at Passchendaele and the Somme. Tanks, mustard gas, biological weapons, automatic weapons, grenades, the beginning of killing by and with airplanes and air flight, Zeppelins. This would transform modernity in another way, right? The application of technology to mass killing and to hyper-nationalism, which would mobilize various countries, starting with, I think it's still fair to say, Germany, at the eve of World War I, Russia, France, Great Britain, to come together in this morphing malignancy of mass killing that unfolded over a 4-year period, okay? Now, World War I, as you well know, would become the theater for the first practice of genocide done in its modern form. Because I want you to situate the Armenian Genocide as an event happening on the Eastern Front of the Great War. And remember, Ottoman Turkey's allies are Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And so we have an interesting nexus of cultural engagement across the Western Front to the Eastern Front. Not enough stuff. More and more, there's a new book on the Ottoman Empire and the Great War that just came out 2 weeks ago. More and more study is happening on the Eastern Front of the war. But for the most part, traditionally, the most scholarship and study has been done on the Western Front and the trench warfares. So I want us to think of the Armenian Genocide in those terms. I also want to situate the history of the genocide with certain seminal perceptions by interesting and important public figures. First, I think it's interesting that just as the war ended in November of 1918, President Theodore Roosevelt, no longer president, former President Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson was president, November 1918, made the statement very loudly in the press that the Armenian massacre was the greatest crime of the war. Now, in a war that had, a variety of crimes and a lot of mass carnage, remember between 11 and 15 million people were casualties in the Great War. Roosevelt's statement rings loudly. The Armenian massacre was the greatest crime of the war. And I would remind you that the coverage of the Armenian massacres. The term genocide wasn't developed until the 1940s by Raphael Lemkin, and it was Lemkin who used the term Armenian Genocide first in the 1940s. But the coverage of the Armenian massacres in the American press was large. The New York Times alone ran 145 articles in 1915, many of them front-page headlines. And so Roosevelt's statement also reflects the awareness and consciousness about this crime against humanity. Which brings me to the second significant statement I'd like to just note here in passing, and that is in May of 1915, at the very beginning of the arrests and deportations of the Armenian population of Turkey and the beginning of the mass killings, Great Britain, France, and Russia issued a telegram to the Ottoman government stating the following: if massacres of the unarmed Christian minority population of Turkey continue, Turkey will be held responsible for, and the new key phrase is, crimes against humanity and civilization. So the importance of that ethical, international, legal term got its baptism with the Armenian massacres in May of 1915. Professor Jenkins noted the famous statement by Adolf Hitler, and I want to pause over it myself for a second. Hitler stated 8 days before invading Poland in 1939, who today, after all, speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians. Now, it's important to note that there was connection between Nazi Germany and the Armenian massacres because of Germany's alliance with Turkey during World War I. The Nazis learned a lot about what the Young Turk government, what the Unionist government did to the Armenians through massive foreign office reports and dispatches, a whole large bureaucracy of witness reportage that came back to Berlin during World War I. But Hitler's statement is important for many reasons. First, it's clear that Hitler was, to some degree, emboldened, or you could even say inspired by the fact that what the Turks had succeeded in doing to a targeted, hated minority population had been successful. You could do that and get away with it. Secondly, he was also emboldened, if you will, by the idea that what had been a large, weighed in on human rights drama of the second decade of the 20th century had disappeared down the memory hole 20 years later. So Hitler's quote does tell you something about the importance of collective and historical memory, that it indeed embodies and has a moral function. And we don't want to lose the importance of that. Lastly, I want to pause over the importance of the Armenian massacres to the man who developed the concept of genocide as a crime in international law and who coined the word genocide, and that is the great Polish Jewish legal scholar, himself a Holocaust survivor, Raphael Lemkin. And we'll look at a picture of Lemkin up here in a bit. Lemkin notes in his autobiography, which came out a year and a half ago, and I urge you all to read. It's a great piece of work, a classic autobiography of the 20th century. It's called Totally Unofficial. Lemkin notes how large an impact the Armenian massacres had on his thinking, and how actually his personal anger about what happened to the Armenians and the fact that the Turkish ruling elite got away with the crime forced him to think deeply about what was wrong with ethics, nation states, and international law. And he has an argument with his professor. He's in graduate school at this time at the University of Lvov. And he says to his professor, look, how can it be that one man kills another man and he's charged with murder, but a nation kills more than 1 million people? And Lemkin put the number even in the 1920s at 1.2 million. A nation kills more than 1 million people and nobody's responsible. And the professor says, there's nothing we can do about it. That's the way national sovereignty works. And Lemkin says, that's outrageous. And he says in his memoir, he said, and I thought that at this time, I would begin to think about how we could develop a law to prevent this. So the impact of the Armenian event on Lemkin is large, and as would the impact of the Holocaust of the Jews of Europe be large on him. And so Lemkin's statements about the Armenian genocide are many, and they're important. I can come back to that if you wish later. So I want to note that in one sense we have the high moral angelic voice of the 20th century Lemkin and the demonic voice of Adolf Hitler, both weighing in on the Armenian massacres in diametrically opposed ways. Now let me come to say something about the implementation of mass killing for my talk today. Obviously, I'm happy to answer other questions about this history, but my focus is on the implementation of mass killing. I suggested earlier to you that the instance of the mass killing of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire represented a shift or a change in the modality of mass killing in comparison with genocide practiced in a pre-modern form. And of course, history is laced with genocidal acts and killings from the beginning of recorded history, from antiquity, the Greeks, the Romans, the Israelites and the Canaanites in the Levant. If you look at the famous case book on the study, on the sociology and history of genocide, the Chalk and Jonasson book, you can get a very interesting map of major genocidal events from the Greeks, the Israelites and Canaanites and Melians to the present. Most of that genocidal practice was done in the context of war and in the context of colonialization. What I'm arguing here today, and what I've argued in my work, is that the Turkish approach to the mass killing of the Armenians is defined by the targeting of an ethnic group or collectivity for the purpose of eliminating that group in a concentrated period of time by using the following: state bureaucracy, nationalist state ideology, technology, advanced communications, and various forms of the mobilization of mass killing through militarization and the establishment of killing squads. And that the mobilization of those cofactors for the targeting and elimination in a concentrated period of time represents a shift in the practice. And so you could say that the Armenian genocide is in some way a template for genocide that would happen later in the 20th century. The Nazis learned something from it. They did different things in their mass killing projects. You find in the Rwandan case a lot of similarities with the Armenian case. And you can look at the map of the 20th century and see how these modalities and anatomies overlap and intersect. So let me start with some some images that will also give you a sense of what I'm about to offer. The map of Armenia there's much to say about it, but you can see the yellow landlocked country in the southwest Caucasus is what is left of Armenia. It's kind of a remarkable survival story that there is an Armenian Republic today in the world. That's about 10% of what was Armenia's historic homeland. You know, the Armenians, as some of you well know, were the first state to make Christianity their national religion in 301. At 301, a little bit before Rome, and piloting their culture in this part of the world at a crossroads between certain parts of the East and West has been very, very difficult. Again, there's much more to say about that. But the red line, the thick red line, can show you an extent of historic Armenian provinces. The big red swatch can show you the most expansive land of the Armenian Empire. This was a short-lived period, but during the 1st century BCE, at the time of Caesar. So Armenia was a an important spot on the Middle Eastern map throughout history. People often ask, what did it look like, before destruction and mass killing? I have a picture here of the 19th century city of Harpert on the East Anatolian plain, and rocky highlands. You see the church dome building is the church. Obviously, religious issues were one of many factors that resulted in the dissolution of the Armenians under the Islamic Ottoman Empire, but not the only issue, but one of many issues. So there's much to say about that. That is a mistitled slide. It's not Harpert, but it's a city further east called Zeytun. But you get a sense of very intense rocky highlands, and it's not easy to kill people in these zones. You have to really be focused with your killing squads to go and arrest and drag people out of these terrains in order to deport and massacre them. I'm going to move past a lot of these slides. They're for another lecture, which I'm happy to come back and give. But right now, let's move forward. This is an interesting image because I mentioned to you that at the outset of World War I, Turkey was allied with Germany and Austro-Hungary, but nevertheless, the Sheikh-ul-Islam ordered a kind of a Fatwa Jihad against the infidels to try to stir up passion among the Ottoman military troops. It didn't really work, in part because two of Turkey's main allies were Christian countries, Austria, Hungary, Germany. But it did fuel flames of anti-Christian sentiment against the minorities inside Turkey, especially the Armenians, who were already in trouble for their political reform aspirations and their pushing the political envelope. I'm happy to talk more about that as well. But that's an interesting image. People often like to look at the faces of perpetrators. So Talat, the Minister of the Interior, and Enver, Minister of War, were two of the three of the triumvirate of what was the Unionist government, Committee of Union and Progress. Often the word Unionist is used. CUP is sometimes used. Young Turks is a more vernacular term. I think what's interesting, if I can go back to Talat, is to start talking about the implementation of mass killing. Let's start with the importance of bureaucracy. Talat was the head of bureaucracy here. If you can think about the roles that people like Heydrich, Goering, and Himmler played in the Nazi genocidal killing projects and in the war projects of World War II, You can think of Talat as overseeing the Ministry of the Interior of the Ottoman government, under which and in which there was the Special Organization, or SO. And I want to kind of just note that the SO is the bureaucracy that I'm most interested in highlighting today for our conversation, because it's the SO that oversaw the deportation and massacres of the Armenians. As I note this, I also want to note that before it was over, the Pontic Greek and the Assyrian populations would also be exterminated. And the Greek population of Western Turkey, all these cultures are living on their own their indigenous lands, as you know, I think. So in a way, the Armenian Genocide was a catalyst for even a larger cleansing of Christians out of Anatolia, out of Asia Minor, out of the historic lands. Close to 4 million Christians were no longer in Turkey, more or less by the early to mid-1920s. So that's something else to conceptualize. Okay, but let's come back to the SO, because what did the SO do? The SO did many things, and there's a whole lecture to be given on that, but let me say that the SO was responsible primarily for mobilizing killing squads. How did it do this? Does anybody know? There's a refrigerator behind door 3 for anybody who gets this right. What? You got it. You got the refrigerator. But you're faculty. You're a scholar. You're a scholar. It's unfair. That's right. The Ministry of the Interior emptied the prisons. About 30,000 convicts. It's a pretty good idea. That's a fairly reliable killing group, most likely. Maybe there were 1 or 2 defectors. So you got 30,000 killing units now being formed. And I'm going to show you a map of the killing fields shortly, and I will talk a little bit about how the killing squads were instructed. But I want to note that. And if you've studied a little bit about the Holocaust, you also know that, before the camps were orchestrated, right? Before the camps were orchestrated, the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi mobile killing squads, were the fundamental mode of mass killing Jews and Roma and Slavs and communists during the early 1940s. Okay. Now, another thing that the SO did, and this is important to understand for modernity, there was a demographic segmentation of the Armenian population. You weren't just killing randomly, right? You were isolating and targeting certain parts of the population. There's Lemkin, by the way, a really beautiful soul who died penniless in his Upper West Side Manhattan apartment at the age of 59, having given his life to outlawing the crime that he named genocide. Okay, the first group that was demographically isolated for the purpose of mass killing were the Armenian Christian soldiers in the Ottoman army. They had been conscripted into the army at the outbreak of World War I. By the beginning of 1915, they were told that they were not reliable, that they were Christian, under Christian suspicion for traitorism. They were disarmed, put into labor battalions where their job was to repair railways, clean latrines, work on roads. But what really happened was that they were now isolated into groups where they could just be mass killed with guns by their fellow Ottoman soldiers, Muslim soldiers. So by the summer of 1915, you've sort of gotten rid of, why is this segment of the population so important? Because they are the able-bodied men between the ages of 15 and about 50. So you've gotten rid of most of that group. The next group you're going to target and isolate are the cultural leaders and intellectuals. Now, the reason that the Armenian Genocide is commemorated on the day of April 24 is because on this evening in Constantinople, now Istanbul, same place, just name changed in 1923, about 250 cultural leaders were rounded up, arrested, and deported. Most of them were killed in the subsequent months of the early summer and midsummer of 1915. All right, so you can see these are distinguished men of letters and writers. The Krikor Zorhab was actually a member of the Ottoman Parliament. The great poet Daniel Varujan suffered a gruesome death in an abandoned field somewhere south of Ankara on an August day of 1915. I'll go back to Varujan. What's the idea here? The idea here is that you cut the head off of the state. Of the culture. Armenia was not a state, it was a culture, the ethnic group. You rip its tongue out. You silence its primary talent, that talent that also has the capacity for resistance. So that's an important thing to note. Fourth, I'd like to focus on the use of the parliament, the use of legislation for the purpose of arresting, massacring, and confiscating the wealth of the Armenian population. Two important laws passed through Parliament in May and September of 1915. The first was called the Temporary Law of Deportation, through which the Armenians were now expeditiously arrested, mass arrested throughout the country in May, June, July, August, September, throughout 1915. That image, I would like to, it's a very important image, and you get a feel for the texture of the moment of the event. That image was seen all over Turkey in the summer of 1915. That was the beginning of the mass killing. And later, at the famous Constantinople court-martial trials in 1919 and 1920, many mid-level and upper-level Ottoman bureaucrats admitted that the word deportation was a code word for massacre. So there is the result of the temporary law of deportation of 1915. And the other law that I think is important is the temporary law of confiscation and expropriation. This gave the Ottoman authorities the right to take over all Armenian movable and immovable wealth. As many scholars have noted, genocide is often a gigantic plundering scheme. You often are able to incite local populations to get involved in the killing project because there's a reward waiting for them, at the end of the day. Armenians were disproportionately wealthy. I don't mean to create a stereotype that they were all rich bankers and all millionaires, but they were probably disproportionately wealthy in comparison with their Muslim neighbors. They were highly educated, many segments of the society in the professions and in business and trade. They constituted the backbone of the small bourgeoisie of the provinces and villages of the interior of Anatolia or Turkey, and therefore there was real wealth to be confiscated and appropriated. So keep those two laws in mind. They are both a part of government apparatus and a part of bureaucracy, both. Fifthly, I want to note the importance of nationalist ideology, because that plays a role in motivating, again, grassroots populations. And I don't want to suggest that all people got involved in the mass killing project. That's not true. There were righteous Turks and Kurds who resisted their government orders, who helped rescue Armenians, and this is always an important and noble part of histories of mass violence. But nevertheless, a lot of people did get involved, and the nationalist ideology of pan-Turkism was important because it was advocating the idea that Turkey could only solve its problems, land loss in the Balkans, tax debts, financial ruin, corruption, fear of invasion during World War I, land takeover. The only way to solve the myriad of problems ailing the Ottoman state was to create a Turkey for Muslims. It really wasn't Turkey for the Turks in a certain way. It really was a Turkey without Christian minorities. Jews were also targeted, but they were a really tiny population. And if you were a Zionist, you were slotted for execution or imprisonment, because that was outlawed. That's another history. But Turkey for the Turks, pan-Turkism, it also included Turkey for the Kurds at this period, although the Kurds would become the next Armenians after World War I, and that's a whole other history that's still unfolding today. So I want to at least note the importance of state-engineered nationalist ideology. Sixth, I want to focus on technology and communications because, well, the Killing Fields map is an interesting map. It shows you where epicenters of mass killing were done, and it shows you how the new technology was fairly effectively used to communicate orders for mass killing. So let me push ahead to the technology. What was one of those pieces of technology that was really important to the genocidal program? It was the telegraph. You know, it may seem like a quaint artifact today, but I would remind you that in the beginning of the 20th century, it was as cool and hot as a MacBook Air. You know, it was a laptop. You could communicate, you could text, it was like texting, right? I mean, it was a smartphone. You could communicate orders quickly over vast distances. So Talat, you remember his picture up on the screen just a few minutes ago, Talat and his staff in the special organization could be communicating strategic plans for the local bureaucrats in the interior regions, and these are, I could talk about every circle on that map if we had time, communicating orders to those spots to arrange and orient and set up killing squads to greet those forced marched people for the purpose of killing them. The other piece of technology is this, the train, the railway. We often think of the railway as being so instrumental to the Nazi project of mass killing, and it was. You can't watch Claude Lanzmann's great film Shoah without seeing the train all the time. But I remind you that deportation of targeted ethnic group members, Armenians, by rail, by cattle car, began here in 1915 during World War I. And that's a pretty dramatic, pretty interesting image, very rich image. You can see the Turkish flag monogrammed on the side of the car, and I think the cars must have been bought from France because I believe there's some French writing on them somewhere. Okay, so there's some images here that are kind of graphic that come from the great, really heroic German medic, Armin T. Wegener, who actually went to jail for smuggling these images out of Turkey. But these images have become very important, texts and visual accounts in an age really quite before kind of really advanced moving images. These images occupy an important spot in the resource, in the archives for this history. I'll show you. I mean, there'd be so much to say about each of these images. They're really rich and complex, mysterious. They allow us into the event in certain textured ways that only images do. That's another, in my mind, image, a few women straggling, because a lot of the men are killed, a lot of the men are gone pretty early on. And you're going to have a lot of women and elderly and children. And I would note, again, just in passing, that another method of eradicating Armenian identity during this genocidal history was kidnapping and abducting women and having them become forced converts. So we have a lot of forced conversion during the genocide. It's another way for identity to be eradicated. You don't have to kill people only to commit acts of genocide. Happy to talk more about that. Wegener himself used the word concentration camp. That image, as gruesome as it is, it's just an image of mass violence on the planet Earth in the modern era. It could be in Western Sudan, in Darfur. It could be in Rwanda in 1994. It could be in Srebrenica in July of 1994. It could be in Pol Pot's Cambodia. It could be in Nazi-occupied Poland of 1944. It's a universal image. There's a lot to say about Ambassador Morgenthau. Maybe we'll put this image up to close. Let me just say that in the end, the Ottoman government succeeded in killing about 1.2 million people, Armenians, out of a population. And some people put the death toll at 1.5 million. Most scholars use the term over a million. Lemkin early on used 1.2 million, as did various other people pretty early on, and that figure is a generally reliable one. So that by the end of World War I, a population of close to 2.5 million Christian Armenians living on their historic lands was almost entirely eradicated. The diaspora today, in part, is made up of the survivors, the million or more survivors, and proliferating continentally around the globe. Today, the Armenian population pushes 8 million. So this is also an interesting story of cultural survival and reflowering and rebirth and much more. So thank you very much. I want to open the floor now for conversation.
You mentioned that this be an appropriate question to answer. Why does the modern Turkish government, from Kemal Mustafa Ataturk on to the present time, basically deny or handle this Armenian genocide in the way it does?
Right. Can I go over here, or do you want me back there?
Yeah.
All right, I'll move in and out. I can't be wired here.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Well, you can. If you want to put that on, you can.
But can you catch me on the... Well, I'll just stay here. It's okay. A lot has been written about Turkish denial. It's so extreme, and it's so obsessive and fetishized that it's become a subject of a lot of scrutiny and a lot of study. I would say that you have to start with the fact that during the carrying out of the crime, the Ottoman government is doing everything it can to cover it up. Not surprising. I mean, perpetrators are always trying to cover up crimes. I don't care whether you're trying to kill one person or 6 million. Covering up and denial accompanies the pathology of criminal behavior. That seems to be true. So you start there, but then you have some eccentric, emanations that are going to happen after. First place, after World War I, the surviving Ottoman government sentenced to death all of the high-ranking officials who perpetrated the massacres of the Armenians. But they all escaped. They all fled to different countries where they had asylum in Germany, for example. They were all assassinated by Armenian revenge groups, and the trials acquitted all the assassins too. These are very interesting stories. But what the next piece of the denial starts when Mustafa Kemal consolidates the new modern Turkish Republic with a series of foundational myths. And Taner Akçam, the Turkish historian, has written about this better than anybody. And he has formulated that among the modern Turkish state's foundational myths are there can be no other ethnic identities in Turkey. Everyone is a Turk, no matter what you are. And more than half the nation, even then, were non-Turks. Kurds are not Turks, Alawites are not Turks, the Laz are not Turks, etc., etc. And the Armenian narrative is to be eradicated. This was part of the foundational myth, that whatever happened to the Armenians was their fault, and there will be no discussion of this. Discussion about what happened to the Armenians was disallowed at the rudimentary foundational structures of the modern Turkish Republic. Therefore, no history book said anything about the Armenians, even though they had built a good piece of the Ottoman Empire over the last 400 years, and they had been indigenous Anatolians since 2500 BC. That was just written about last week in the New York Times. So the Armenians are written out of history early on as a foundational myth. Then I think you come to the big issue, and that is that the Turkish state is an authoritarian state that controls a national educational system. Now, we don't do this in the United States. This doesn't happen in free societies or in democratic societies. Nations and democratic societies do not write a mandated, ideologically based curriculum to stamp on every student's head and outlaw any inquiry. But that's what's happened in Turkey for the last 100 years. Free inquiry, about critical inquiry, which is the cornerstone of democratic thinking and the cornerstone of our educational system, disallowed in a society like Turkey. Turkey's not the only society in which these things are disallowed by any means, but it is consequential. So the Armenian event became tabooized, then denied, and then institutionally disallowed from public discourse. So you're socializing generation after generation to believe the following: whatever happened to the Armenians was their fault, and there'll be no discussion about it. In summation, that's what's happened until very recently, when there have been really some important breakthroughs inside Turkey. We have a number of Turkish scholars writing openly and honestly about the Armenian past in Turkey. We have conferences being put on. We have commemorations for the genocide happening. So this is a new development, but the state's position hasn't changed. And if you go look at the Turkish government's websites, you would say to yourself, if you knew nothing about the Armenian past in Turkey, and you went to the Turkish Tourist Ministry's website, and the third item listed is false Armenian allegations. What is that doing on the Tourist Ministry website? That's the degree of reactive paranoia and fetishizing and fear that has been instilled inside of Turkey about the Armenian past. I mean, the point is, I think that all societies at some point or other create big lies. The U.S. has created its share of big lies. We've been able to dig out of many of those big lies. I mean, the slavery, Jim Crow big lie, the genocide of the Native Americans big lie. I mean, those lies were much more predominant in the U.S. in the middle of the 20th century than they were for your generation, and I know for my children's generation coming of age as students in the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century. But Turkey, the problem inside of Turkey is, how does an authoritarian government dig out of its big lie? Right now it's getting pressure from progressive elements inside of Turkey, and we're going to see how that plays out. Yes, back there.
Yeah, can you put that map you show where the Armenian population were? Yeah, right there. Yeah, you talk about Turkey. Where's Turkey there?
The Ottoman Empire is going from west of the map through this region, at this point down into the Levant and across a piece of the Arabian Peninsula. It's not a full map of the Ottoman Empire.
In that time, Turkey wasn't Turkey.
No, it wasn't the modern.
It was Ottoman Empire.
It wasn't the modern Republic of Turkey.
Yes.
It was the Ottoman Turkey.
When Mustafa Kemal fought against Ottoman Empire, he took all that population, built an army against Ottoman Empire, knocked down the Ottoman Empire in 1923.
Well, he was involved in also a war against invading Greek forces. There was a civil war as well.
Well,
Right.
in that time there was Armenians, there were Kurds, there was Turks. They all fought against Ottoman Empire.
No, they were fighting in the Ottoman army. All those ethnic groups were fighting in the Ottoman army. Yes, yes.
Can I just add a couple things about the denial, not now, but in the past? I think part of the problem was psychological too, that the Ottoman and the Turks were not considered equal to Europeans. There was a sick man of Europe, denigration of the Turks, so that to admit to something like this would just reinforce the stereotypes that there were of Turks, and a sense of injustice that the Western literature would tend to focus in on Christian suffering. But if you look at the Balkans and the revolutions for independence, there was ethnic cleansing of Muslims as well in part of Ottoman history. That
Right.
didn't get much
Right,
attention, so there was a sense of injustice. It
right,
doesn't justify
right.
what goes on. But let me ask, that would be.
Well, I'm happy to respond to that if you want me to, or are you asking me a question?
I'm just, what the literature has said, and Turks have said about this. Then the second thing, the question would be, if you look at the context, you do mention that we're talking about war. How do you respond? It doesn't justify at all. This is of a completely higher magnitude what happens to the Armenians. But you do have massacres taking place of Muslims prior to the deportation. There are guerrillas moving, and there is a sense of, kind of like if you put it in the Texas context,
Right,
the Ottoman Empire is at its last Alamo. They're
Sure.
fighting for the last bit of land that's the center of the empire. And anything that threatens that state, it becomes very much a driving force.
right.
And you could factor away some nationalism and other factors and say that that also is a very important mindset that transcends some of the national identities of the different ethnic groups at the top.
Okay, I agree with what you're saying, but is there a question?
How do you factor that in?
Well, again, you know, if I were going to give a talk today about the context for the Armenian Genocide, these are things I would talk about at length. Today's talk was about something else. It's about kind of paradigms of modalities of mass killing. I think the siege mentality in Constantinople at the outbreak of World War I was highly paranoid about the loss of any more lands of the empire. And the Armenians were seen as an ethnic group who had been politically edgy, who had really pushed the envelope, demanding reform and change for minorities inside of Turkey. And this was, in a way, unthinkable. I mean, Christian minorities were not in the practice of demonstrating in public in downtown Constantinople in the 1890s for change. I mean, so the Armenians had accrued an identity as now a rebellious Christian minority asking for change. And the question Armenians were asking was this: can a Christian be the equal of a Muslim in the Ottoman Empire? I believe that's, in my historiographic view, the fundamental question that was being asked. So the Armenians are already tainted, as troublesome, and had already been punished with wholesale massacre during Sultan Abdul Hamid's purges of the 1890s, 94, 96. So there's a lot of siege mentality. Armenians are seen as, untrustworthy, although, frankly, 99% of the Armenian population was just unaware of anything. They were living their normal domestic lives in villages and towns throughout the Ottoman Empire. And at certain sensitive spots, there were Armenian radicals who were acting dramatically in various ways. So you have the siege mentality contributing to a kind of focus on the Armenians as a group that has to be gotten rid of. I think it's true that the Balkan Wars had a huge impact on Turkish paranoia because Turkey lost 85% of its European colonies. But what isn't understood in Ottoman historiography, and I think this has to happen, in the coming generation, that is, there needs to be a post-colonial theory applied to Ottoman studies. Because frankly, what were the Bulgarians and the Greeks and the Montenegrins and the Albanians and others doing? But they were involved in a decolonization movement. I mean, these were not indigenous Turkic lands. They were colonized places, and they were Muslim colonizing Christians, and this created even more tension. Although the Arabs as well, in the Levant and in the Arabian Peninsula, wanted desperately to get out from under Turkish rule. So I think the Ottoman Empire is actually, if you want to start with the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, and then see the Egyptian episode of the ensuing decades, you're going to see a long period of Ottoman decolonization. And I think decolonization is a more sophisticated way of understanding the change that happened to the demography of Eastern Europe and the Middle East during this period. So some reflections on your points, which are absolutely right. Yes?
Are there any students who have questions? Professor shouldn't.
Yeah, please come, students, come. Any questions you might have about the Black Dog story, I'm happy to talk about. Yes, sir.
Was there a specific reason why the genocide happened when it happened? Because for hundreds of years, the Armenians were being persecuted and hated by the Turks of the Ottoman Empire. So I'm just wondering if there was a specific reason or certain events that caused the genocide to happen when it did.
Yes, absolutely. It wasn't simple being legally classified as infidel in the Ottoman Empire, but you could get along okay and even fine if you played by certain rules. But the rules were really precarious, and life for Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire was precarious. Not enough good social history has been written. The best social history is in narratives and memoirs. If you want to see what it meant to be a Christian living in a mountain village in the Van region of Turkey, you'll find out a lot about the complexity, and I want to emphasize the complexity of living in a system. One of the most interesting dramatizations of the lives for Christians in the Ottoman Empire is in Elia Kazan's great Oscar-winning film of 1963, America, America. If you haven't seen this film, I just urge you to watch it. For me, it's Kazan's greatest film. And I have an essay on it in my new book, which is out in 3 weeks. Can I take this moment to plug it? My book, that is, I have a really interesting essay on Kazan's film and Greeks and Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. My book is a selected essays. So let me come back to this by saying, so life for Christians was undulatingly complex given the political conditions of one century to the other. But as I was mentioning in my response just now, but as Armenians begin to lead protest and reform movements in the late 19th century, they're met with rage by the Sublime Porte. This is unacceptable behavior for minorities. Minorities don't publicly protest for equal rights and so forth. So Armenians are now becoming perceived, and they are accruing a kind of tension, a political tension within Ottoman life. They have already been subjected to a huge period of massacre in the mid-1890s, and then another episodic massacre in 1909. So during these periods, the targeted ethnic groups' value becomes dehumanized. It's much easier to commit genocidal acts or mass-killing acts when you've dehumanized the targeted group. But then World War I becomes an absolutely key context for genocide to be carried out, because it did supply the Young Turk government with a screen, an opportunity, and a pretext. Here, let me read to you Ambassador Morgenthau's famous telegram back to the State Department. There it is. July 16, even we have 1 p.m. And from harrowing reports of eyewitnesses, it appears that a campaign of race extermination is in progress under a pretext of reprisal against rebellion. Now that is, of course, very perceptive and accurate. It's accurate. Morgenthau got it right that early on. He was getting dispatches from his foreign consuls, his consuls in the Armenian provinces of the interior. But the point is, it's wartime that allows for the security measure idea to be upped. And historians and sociologists have coined this term, total war. Total war is the condition that societies enter into during wartime when mobilization and militarization are pervasive and national security paranoia ends up being the highest priority, therefore legitimating almost anything, if you will, in the name of state security. So I think World War I is very important. And I think the Balkan Wars are very important for making Turkey feel ever more paranoid, anxious, and insecure about more problems with Christian minorities. Student? Okay, that counts.
Considering that in the past few, basically going around it, there's been a lot of bickering about the definition of genocide, whether the Armenian genocide is actually a genocide or it's the massacres, etc. How important do you feel that actually labeling it as a genocide and accepting that label is to the whole event?
Yeah, everybody hear the question, how important is the term genocide to the Armenian case? Because I think that the controversy over this is really the result of Turkish, denialism, that Turkey has demanded that this not be verified And so for a while there was, squabbling over this. I will say this for the record, and I want to, really, this is unambiguous. The only 3 cases of genocide that the most minimalist of genocide theorists agree on, and Bill Shabis would be the most distinguished of them here, are the Armenian case in Turkey, the Jewish case in Central Europe, and the Tutsi case in Rwanda. Those are the only, so these are the 3 unambiguous agreements. This is unanimous in the genocide studies field. It's not to say that there couldn't be nationalist scholars in Turkey or whatever who can't.
How about the Hojali? Armenian people killed all the Muslim people over there?
You're out of, I would not,
Thank you. This is the context for student engagement, student learning.
sorry.
Other students, please.
I'm happy to talk about that if you want, but so that's unambiguous. And I think the fact that Lemkin is the articulator of the rubric Armenian Genocide is really important and goes a long way. That it's Lemkin who comes up with the term Armenian Genocide. It's Lemkin who's the first person to use the term genocide in the 1940s. And it's Lemkin who goes on record in his own autobiography talking about the impact of this event on his thinking. So, so is it important? It's important because it's accurate and precise. However, again, as a scholar in the field of genocide studies, I want to say that crimes against humanity are all ethically equal, and I think that there should be more prosecutorial power for crimes against humanity. I don't think genocide should hog the show when it comes to legal recourse. So I think that, I'm not a legal scholar, nor am I a practicing international lawyer on human rights, but my own feeling is that the drawback for genocide being perceived as the ultimate crime against humanity, it is an importantly defined crime, but I don't think that crimes of ethnic cleansing, of mass murder, of crimes against humanity should be thought of as any less ethically and morally meaningful. Yes?
Why did the Christian religious authorities not hear about this or take a bigger stance on it in their countries? Like maybe the Catholic Church didn't hear about this when it was going on.
No, that's not true. There was a lot of outrage. It was really huge movements from the Christian communities around the world. So the Pope, I all I can say about the Pope, blanking on the Pope's name from 1915. Anybody remember? Was it Innocent? I can't remember. The Pope made various declarations to the Sublime Porte demanding the cessation of the Armenian massacres. The Protestant missionary groups in the U.S. had huge operations for Armenian relief and rescue. So there was a big worldwide rescue and relief movement. But the problem is these are NGO movements, and they're not government movements. So when it comes to government intervention during the 19-teens, governments weren't there. The Wilson government, Wilson's U.S. policy was not even to declare war on Turkey. So therefore, we didn't have teeth to go in and intervene. Anyway, there's a rich history on that, and I've written a book called The Burning Tigris, Armenian Genocide in America's Response, in which there's a lot about the Protestant missionary engagement with the Armenians. It's a rich history. Okay?
My question was, where's the disconnect between in 1915, 100 stories being written in the New York Times to now when there's no stories? So how does that figure into American like America recognizing the genocide is only because of our relation to Turkey now, or like what's the disconnect?
You know, I think what you're saying is, why did this fall out of the memory? Why did this fall down the memory in the amnesia pit, right? I think it's a result of a few things. First, you have a lack of human rights culture in the world in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, frankly. There's no such thing. The culture that the kind of courses you're taking now didn't exist in the curriculum because there was no human rights culture in the US, let's say, in which historical memory, human rights, crimes, trauma and memory, these things were not part of the discourse and parlance of the world even. So you don't have a lot of language or apparatus or tools to even get hold of these histories once they've happened. Secondly, Armenia is going to become a Soviet republic, okay? Doesn't have its own State Department or state. So you don't have an Armenian, let's just say, political station, you know, a broadcast station for a national narrative. Armenian diasporans are just shell-shocked from the genocide experience and are trying to reorient themselves in the world. And thirdly, you have this Turkish denial campaign. Anytime the Armenian story raises its head, in comes Ankara with its coercion and anger and blackmail. You may know the famous story of the Turkish government stopping MGM from making what would have been the first film about the Armenian Genocide in 1935, based on Franz Werfel's novel, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh. So if Ankara can do that in Hollywood, that's a real stab in the narrative, you know? So you have these factors resulting in the dissolution of the collective memory. But then you have the reemergence of collective memory starting in the mid-1960s on. And you're going to get this for various reasons. Armenians have their first commemoration at the 50th anniversary, a worldwide commemoration. And secondly, you're going to get the beginning of what I call human rights culture in this country. And I think the U.S. kind of leads the world, led the world in this, in part because of the African American civil rights movement, in part because of Holocaust, the beginning of a Holocaust memory discourse, and other factors. So you're going to get the reemergence of this in the late 1960s, and it's going to build and build and build and really by the 1990s, the Armenian Genocide has become a pretty strong scholarly discourse and intellectual discourse, and now finds itself claiming its normative place, I hope, in the curriculum, and especially in the teaching of World War I, where it belongs as a part of history. Yes?
Kind of bouncing off his question, I've heard lately there's been a lot of not pro-Turkey necessarily, but like Turkish legislation about like funding of Turkey and whatnot because the U.S. and Turkey are allies. I'm just wondering if you think the U.S. formally will ever recognize Armenian genocide and what effect that will have on the Armenian culture, because me as an Armenian, I don't want that to happen.
Right.
So I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you know, I think that this whole issue of recognition through resolutions is only even meaningful because of Turkish denial. If you didn't have this whole propaganda program coming from a nation state, no one would need this. So the recognition I want to suggest to everyone is about a redress on the ethical issue of no accountability, ever. Not even a humane gesture. I mean, it's a pretty extreme situation that Ankara has backed itself into. Now, having said that, I think that the recognition thing can have value, symbolic value, but I would also note that from my own experience with members on Capitol Hill over the years, the good news is there's no misunderstanding about the meaning of this history. I don't hear any like, well, are you sure this happened this way? That seems to be unambiguous now. But what's still in place is that the US State Department doesn't believe it's worth spending the political capital on an ethical issue of the Armenian-Turkish situation. They haven't determined that that's a priority. So until the State Department is willing to get a little more ethical courage, I would say, because 22 countries have done this, and in every case it's the same. Ankara has a hysterical fit, pulls its embassy out of a given country. France lost a bunch of contracts with Turkey for a few months, and then everything goes back to normal. Because Turkey's a powerful country in the region, but it needs its powerful allies. So in a way, the fact that Poland and Russia and Greece and Italy and Sweden and France, all these countries are able to pass these resolutions speaks poorly of U.S. cowardice, I suppose. Will it happen? I hope so. But I wouldn't lose sleep over it, because I think the good news is, there's something hypocritical about it, and that's angering, for sure. The good news is that I think the process of education has had a big impact on knowledge and understanding. Politics is always contingent on weird elements coming into place at a particular moment. Who would have ever believed that Ronald Reagan's trip to the German cemetery at Bitburg in 1984 would have the fallout of getting the U.S. to ratify the 1948 Genocide Convention? I'm just illustrating the weirdness of political chains of events. So we don't know what kind of chains of events could result in the U.S. State Department saying, hey, maybe it's time that we get a little more courage in our belt and at least do it right on the Armenian past. Maybe we'll go to 8 o'clock, I think, or yes, in the back, yes.
From a political perspective, how would you consider the Young Turks using, enacting deportation and eventually genocide as kind of a political move to consolidate power? Because up until that time, the Turk wasn't a proud warrior for the people, and this kind of brought, I think, more of nationalism to it. So how much was it really disdain of the Armenians, and how much was actually, the Young Turks using a kind of adept political move of creating cultural pride for themselves?
Well, I think these things are connected. I think the feeling among the Ottoman ruling elite at the outbreak of World War I was that we need to stanch the blood flow. We have to remobilize a Turkey for the Turks. Pan-Turkism was part of this, and that the mass killing and removal of the Armenians and then of the Pontic Greeks and then of the Assyrians was part of the assertion of extreme nationalism. So if you want to call, one of course is deeply disturbed to think of the mass killing of babies and women as an assertion of strength. But I think the idea that we have to cleanse the population of Christian minorities suggests something about the new adaptation of nationalism to a siege mentality moment. Okay, we still have time. We'll go to 8. Yes?
Mr. Balakian, I will ask my question directly from the most respected Jewish scholars on the Middle East, Professor Bernard Lewis. Direct quote from him. What happened to the Armenians was the result of massive Armenian armed revolution against the Turks, which began even before First World War broke out and continued on larger scale. Great numbers of Armenians joined the Russian forces invading Turkey. Armenian rebels actually seized the city of Van and held it for a while, intending to hand it over to the invaders. What is your take on Professor Lewis's view that there was an Armenian rebellion against the Turks?
Well, two things. First, on Professor Bernard Lewis, he's been pretty much debunked as a candy-coated consensual historian of the mid-20th century. You know, Lewis's idea of history was practiced by historians in the US as well, and that is that you create a triumphal narrative for the nation that you're supporting, and he's supporting a Turkish nationalist narrative. So in a way, what he's saying is unreliable and inaccurate. He's been a pretty pernicious character as a denialist. He's not without his talent, but his simplistic cliches don't hold up to modern research at all. I think it's important to say that at Van, Armenians resisted massacre, but resisting massacre is a pretty fundamental human instinct. When possible, Armenians resisted massacre at 4 places. But if you were being massacred, you would resist. Urfa, Musadag, Shabin Karahisar, and at Van. That there were ethnic Armenians in the Russian army was true. I mean, there were a couple million Armenians living in Russia. These are here it is, pretext of reprisal against rebellion. That's, frankly, Ambassador Morgenthau has answered Bernard Lewis. Now, he should be ashamed of himself. One last one. Yes?
For those who'd like to read, what, say, 2 or 3, 4 books would you recommend on this subject?
I would recommend Taner Akçam's several books, and the full name of Taner's first book in English is called A Shameful Act: The Ottoman Government's Responsibility for the Armenian Genocide. I mean, so he's the most cutting-edge Turkish historian on this history. His most recent book is the Ottoman Empire and Genocide, a study in ethnic cleansing of the Greeks and Armenians. So I would recommend the 2 recent Taner Akçam books. I would read Ambassador Morgenthau's memoir of 1920. It's now reissued. It's just called Ambassador Morgenthau's Story. It's an amazing story of a U.S. ambassador from a neutral country, because the U.S. never declared war on Turkey. And it's his insight to the whole reality of the outbreak of World War I, the mass killing of the Armenians, and it was the first time the genocide came, the narrative of the genocide came into English. Maybe, I guess another book I would recommend is the most important Armenian survivor narrative called Armenian Golgotha by Grigoris Balakian. My same last name as mine. He is my great-great-uncle, and I was the collaborative translator of this book. It's an extraordinary story of a survivor experience, and reviewers refer to it as the equivalent of a Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel for the Armenian case. So those are some. There's a lot. I also like Robert Melson, M-E-L-S-O-N, Revolution and Genocide, on the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust. So it's the best comparative study of these 2 events. It's a University of Chicago Press paperback today. Donald Bloxham's The Great Game of Genocide is an important book, but that's enough. I'll leave you there. I'll leave you with those books. Thank you very much.
Thank you.